Hi, my name is Brian. I'm with Sea Game Studios, and today I'd like to talk a little bit about scale and Sailpower. We originally wrote Sailpower to work with 15 millimeter models, and depending what your definition of 15 millimeter is, you might think of what we call 15 millimeters 20 millimeter. The reason for that is I come from a modeling background, and the whole to the eye or to the top of the head thing is not something that was real known to me when I was developing Sailpower. And all the miniatures I bought were actually about 17 millimeters high, give or take. My 15 millimeter is about 1/100th scale, or an eighth of an inch to a foot. Like I say, whether you consider that 15 or 20, your actual mileage may vary. So why 15 millimeter? 15 millimeter I determined to be a good balance between not a teeny little miniature that's sitting on the table that doesn't feel like a ship but feels more like a 3D chit, versus 28 millimeter, which the models are very, very large. And while you see some gorgeous 28 millimeter stuff, the restriction always seems to be that you can't do a lot of sailing with them. If they're accurately sized, they're enormous. A lot of the 20s you see out there are actually undersized. We'll get into that in a little bit. So 15 millimeter was a good balancing point for me, where you could have gorgeous ships that you could paint up and they felt like, your ship, versus really teeny, and still giving you some sailing characteristics. We originally tested the game heavily with very small ships, 6 and 8 gun ships, on the kitchen table, and it played great. And that was what we were going for. Over time, we got two basic things that happened to us. We would show the ships to people. We had the critique that, well, I already have 28 millimeter models, and so why don't you do stuff in 28? We did like one hand sculpted model in 28, but it was not a scale we majorly pursued until more recently. We'll get into that when we talk about 28. The other thing we heard is that I don't have space to play this at home. So, despite the fact that we play tested on the kitchen table, people would come and they'd see our giant play surface and they'd be like, wow, that's awesome. I couldn't do that at home. Even in the context of having a large kitchen table is hard for some people. If you're a college student and you're in a dorm, or you just have very limited, more like a coffee table of space, or a single folding table in the garage or in the basement, that's your space. We wanted you to be able to play our big game in small scale, and so we went back to the drawing board and tried to decide, could we give you a larger model, but still be small enough to fit that space. I didn't want to go 1/1200th or 1/2400th. These were the itty bitty. I wanted maybe ships like that, maybe that on the biggest side. Something where you could fit a good game onto a standard 6 foot by 30 inch table. And the scale I came to is what is either 5 or 6 millimeter scale. 5 millimeter if you're European, 6 millimeter if you're in the States. It's basically about 1/300th scale. And the beautiful thing about that particular scale is that it's exactly 1/3 of the native scale, 15 millimeter. And so what that would mean is that if I were to take my ruler and flip it over, I could then go ahead and play the game in centimeters instead of inches, with no other conversions, no fancy figuring out anything, just play it in centimeters. And it would be the exact same gameplay experience if the miniatures were the same stats. There would be zero difference other than the fact that the game is smaller physically. We originally sculpted just a few ships that were copies of our 15 millimeter hand sculpts in 6 millimeter, and it was a really expensive development process for us We basically were only able to do a few. The sculpting process was very expensive. My hand sculpting expertise doesn't work as well in super miniature. So I let my cousin, who's a professional jeweler, do it, and she doesn't work for cheap. She does ladies' rings and diamonds, and jewelry is expensive work, and so is the waxwork that made those miniatures. So for a while, that's what we thought we were going to do for 6. We did basically every now and then we'd send a new model to her. She would caliper it, measure it down, and make it in 6mm. The big revolution happened this year with a technology that we've been playing with our other games for a while, but hadn't really thought about for ships, and that is CAD and 3D printing. So the problem with CAD always was that I could spend, with my love of accuracy of miniatures, I could spend thousands of hours sculpting a single ship. I could build every single frame member exactly correct, plank it exactly so, and that would produce a beautiful thing that wouldn't necessarily be a good game miniature, and I would have so many hours into it. I couldn't do that many types of ships. It just wasn't viable. And the breakthrough happened this year at Adepticon. The Saga community was looking for Viking ships, and it's kind of vexing me a little bit because I'd never got around to sculpting them a Viking ship, and they wanted one and I didn't have it. So in the hotel room, I was able to basically in CAD fabricate a Viking ship. It wasn't individual frame members, but it was built out of basic constructs of shapes and forms bent to shape, and it came out pretty nice. And from there, we started applying some methodologies that I learned from marine architects. The CAD program I use, Rhino, is actually heavily used by marine architects. There's a lot of videos on the internet that talk about, building hulls from a single surface and by bending and shearing and manipulating and all that kind of stuff. Very technical. Don't want to get too much into it, but basically, it's had this great breakthrough where we were able to build some nice boats and 3D print them, and now we offer our game in 3 scales. So we have 6mm, which is a great scale if you're in an apartment, small, very playable. You can play the same big game we do at the conventions on a single 6-foot table. One play mat, some islands, some houses, and you got the whole convention experience in miniature. 15mm is still glorious. It's a great scale. It's big. You can have really, really pretty boats, and a game club is the champion. I mean, they're going to draw the oohs and ahs, but you can still sail around. You're not putting your miniature on the sail and basically just sailing like 10 feet, and then, now we're deck to deck, and all we can do is shoot at each other. That being said, I'm good friends with a lot of the people in the Pathfinder community out there, and I know that there is a great desire for good quality 28mm boats. I once jokingly thought of making a sign that says "Ship Matters," and it was going to be a kind of slightly snarky poke at my other ship-making friends out there that make boats that look like they're either out of a cartoon or very inaccurate and not just not what you'd hope for from a gaming miniature. So I knew there was a desire in the 28 community to get some nice ships, and so since we are now 3D printing, we were able to go ahead and do that. We actually have our Buccaneer sloop, which is the same sculpt as you would have in 15 or in 6, but it's gloriously large. It's like 10 inches by like 3 3/4 or something like that. It's a large miniature. It's very light because it's 3D printed, and we plan on continuing to do that. So we're going to continue to have that scale model. Now, if you're playing Sailpower and not, say, Pathfinder or some kind of role-playing game with it, you still do that. You got to have a lot of space to sail around, really. The smaller ships, maybe not so bad. The Buccaneer sloop, you could do that on a pretty large game table, but basically, if you want to play Sailpower it's basically 2 times 15. So whatever the actual range is, you just divide it in half, and you get your Sailpower range that way. So you can convert it to other scales. I've got some in the book for what you might want to do for 1/1200th or 1/2400th. I don't really think you need to go smaller in scale than the 1/300th, the 6 millimeter. 6 millimeter is large enough that the ships still feel like ships, and the goal of Sailpower is for you to be a captain of a ship or a small squadron of ships. It's not for you to be Admiral Nelson at Trafalgar. I mean, I'm sure you could play that with Sailpower, and maybe some way we'll do that. But there are 101 games that allow you to recreate Trafalgar. We want you to be a captain, and we feel that 6 millimeter is a nice small scale to do that. 15 millimeter is a great game club scale to do that. And if you absolutely have gobs of space and you want to do it in 28 millimeter, we're hoping to be able to support you there as well. So it's a little bit about scales and Sailpower, why we do what we do. Hopefully that's been helpful to you. Feel free to check out our social feeds on Facebook, or drop us an email if you have any questions. Any designs you'd like to see in any scale, post up on the social. We're always looking at that to see what we should sculpt next. If there's anything you see in some of the other scales that you're like, well, I'd like it in my scale, again, let us know. Again, my name is Brian, and you guys have a great day.